Since the end of World War II, the developed world has applied some of its best minds and huge resources into the problems of underdevelopment. Some 50 years and $1.7 trillion of debt later, environmentalists, non-governmental organizations, and social scientists claim that these efforts have been seriously flawed. Many projects, they claim, were ill-designed, causing damage to the environment. Others were never completed. Still others have been abandoned for lack of local support. What went wrong, and how can it be made right? Against this turbulent background, for more than a year now, the Development Committee, an advisory board of the World Bank and the IMF, has been examining these issues. The Secretariat of the Task Force, set up to examine the role of the multilateral development banks, held a workshop in Cape Town, South Africa, to study the role that the World Bank and the African Development Bank have played and should play in improving the development system. Some 35 participants were invited from all parts of Africa to give their frank and honest views on the reasons for past failures and to recommend changes. Mr. Willie Wapenhans, the head of the Secretariat, opened the workshop by tracing the source of turbulence in the development environment to three sources: the collapse of the socialist experiment, the change in role for nation-states, and globalization of markets. The workshop was organized by ODII's Turid Sato and Bill Smith from Washington, and Biki Minyuku from South Africa. For the first assignment, Bill challenged the participants to envision what successful development would look like. What emerged was a clear, energetic, and transforming image: the African ideals for people-centered development.
This is a hierarchy of structures, starting with the source of all power, being the people themselves participating in the development process.
And when we're talking about mutual respect, we are talking about a group of people who are going to make a decision that we need to be in partnership with ABCD on behalf of the people.
A second set of ideals that emerged identified the principles on which this people-centered organization should be based.
That it is only through participation that you create a forum, a real forum, for the evolution of a common vision.
I've had so many qualifications to democracy in Africa, and that invariably all of them are an attempt to justify a diluted and guided form of democracy. So why don't we just stick to democracy and assume it implies full participation in decision making? That's the definition of democracy.
We felt the recipient countries are playing the role of a passive role in the partnership. So we said equality in partnership.
You know, when Washington and Paris arrived, they assume that you don't know democracy. When many times you have more than they did. Now, the majority of the people do understand democracy, but when you are talking about the procedures of Westminster and the Bundestag and Congress, of course they don't know the language, they don't know the system. But if it's democracy, the people, at least some Africans, know.
A third set of ideals, more holistic in scope, dealt with the purpose and context of development.
When you say you're a development bank, what do you mean by development? What development? Whose development? And by whom?
The meaning of development can only be determined within a context. But what does this context say about African development?
There is the erosion of African values. Looking at African values as primitive, anything. No. We tend to be close together. You know, in Africa, if there's death or there is any happiness, you see how however poor we are, we tend to be together. There was that togetherness which was beyond the natural. It had to be spiritual.
For the second task, ODII asked participants, if we are to make progress towards the kind of development systems you have identified, what are the major current realities that have to be faced? Participants saw Africa in a state of crisis with problems in the political system, problems in the economic system, and problems in the social system. An image of a train symbolizes their frustration with the twin bureaucracies of government and the MDBs. At one end, the government and the MDBs are in the engine driving the train in one direction, while at the other end, people are pulling the train in the opposite direction. The politicians are in the middle, running up and down without direction. At the end of each section, Mr. Wapenhans reflected on the participants' discussions, including this one on realities.
Availability of credit is not a constraint. The availability of credit worthiness is a constraint. And that's why you need these institutions. If you were credit worthy, you could do away with the institutions.
In order to identify the priorities that would move Africa toward its ideals, participants created a marketplace for influence. Each participant placed their priorities on sheets of paper and then persuaded and cajoled others to join their group. After 20 minutes of hectic exchange, the participants had organized into 5 groups: good governance, people empowerment, private sector, donor policies and delivery system, effective delivery systems for stakeholders. The results of the discussions were surprising. The hot issues were not rancor against the government, MDBs, or the struggle for scarce resources.
And that's where private sector also have to pay to support the development of research and development to let the private sector move ahead.
You are assuming the existence of a research culture in the African fabric. Now, I regret to say that in our culture, we do not take easily to postponing consumption in return for dividends tomorrow.
The debate was on broader issues. For example, the role of the media and academic institutions in supporting development.
They do not think that it is their role to inform society about what information to inform. They think their role is just to abuse and attack government and any official, any woman like me who is outstanding in society, they must destroy.
One group used the image of an umbrella to illustrate governance. The handle of the umbrella, the central pillar, was democratization and democratized MDBs. The umbrella kept the rain of poor governance out.
I heard about a strong government, but a strong government needs to have a strong society.
Another group saw the private sector as a businessman drawing from a well that is almost dry. The government's facilitating role is depicted as the pulley, while tiny MDBs pull on the same rope as the private sector.
The private sector, as I said, even foreign investors coming in, either the local one, they are there to work for profit.
What is this bank and what was the motive when it was formed 40 whatever years ago? On the policies, we felt that there should be a refocus. The means that actually they have sort of got away from the original focus to a refocus on reconstruction and development rather than involvement in management of a world club and economic policing of the globe.
The role of women in development was constantly raised and debated with considerable effect.
It's very difficult for villagers or indeed women, because I've seen there's an undue emphasis on women in this workshop. Yeah, my perception is that women are partners in development. Therefore, there is basically no need to structure specific programs, if at all we agree that they are partners in development.
Those producers in Africa, it was observed that they are generally women. And these are the very people who don't get these funds, who don't access them. And therefore, it should come up very clearly. But the spokesman doesn't believe in that. Therefore, that's why he was underplaying.
We have division of roles, private sector, women and women of Africa standing up and doing business, creating jobs, and offering employment to their community, and at the same time doing regional and inter-regional and intercontinental trade to improve balance of payment of their various countries.
And I want to say really, as long as you go excluding women, there will be no development. In fact, you are wasting the people's time, you are wasting the people's money on a very, very few people who walk around with three-piece suits.
By the end of the conference, participants began to include the special perspective and needs of women into their plans and programs.
We thought further that there was need to separate the empowerment of women from the overall objective of human resource development, because the issue of women empowerment needs to stand out on its own.
We want to try and have a process which is bottom-up approach. We are not going to encourage a situation where NGOs also become monsters and start behaving as if they own communities. That the communities themselves should be encouraged to take control of their own affairs.
Africans want to take responsibility for their own development. They want to assess their own needs and participate fully in the planning process.
I am more inclined to use internal resources, local resources to begin with.
You have left with me the impression that this process of participation is even ahead of the attack on poverty. And as I was listening to you, I began to understand what you were telling me. You were telling me that it's no good dealing with poverty if you cannot ensure continuous participation as a process which enables people to deal with poverty.
When there is trouble in these countries, don't send in any money. The people are prepared to suffer, because the more you give money to these bad governments, the more you are perpetuating their stay and suppressing the people forever.
Decolonization of the African mind was a high priority and should begin right down at the school level.
We need a relevant education. We don't need where we come and start telling us that there is an apple that is going to fall from down when I can use a mango where my child will understand, other than first asking me, what does an apple mean?
The major role for the MDBs is to create flexible financial mechanisms that are more responsive to financial needs on every level, from the household through the village to the province to the nation. The participants felt that the multilateral banks underestimated the importance of regionalization and were not very effective in coordinating between themselves.
In fact, if you read the articles of association, regional integration is very much played down. It hardly features anywhere. It's only the ADB which mentions it. But the World Bank, it's a silent issue. In fact, sometimes I'm tempted to state that the World Bank has nationalized development.
In their final reflections, each of the participants expressed, in a different way, a spirit of renewal that would help them in their work as they returned home. The message for the MDBs is simple and clear. Development cannot be done for people. It can only be done by them. What Africans want from the MDBs is their expertise in building financial support systems that are responsive to their needs. The rest, Africans must do for themselves. This new wave of change, born of the power of ordinary people, shaped by democratic processes, and accelerated by the human spirit, will sweep through the old structures, changing attitudes, forging new relationships, creating new channels for action. This is the quiet revolution, as steady, sure, and relentless as the winds and waves bearing down on these South African shores.
We may have to get new wine skins.
How we can go and do things.